Hey guys, welcome back to the Shenanigans with Shreya podcast. It is a lovely sunny winter day. We're seeing the sun after quite some time amidst the cold snap that we're in at the moment. So it's lovely to have a slightly warmer day. So today's neuroscientific fun fact is that research has found out that you unconsciously perfectly sync up your blinking, your eye blinking, to the music that you're listening to. Neuroscience research reveals that our spontaneous eye blinks naturally sync up to the beat of music, which is a hidden form of auditory motor synchronization that happens completely outside of our conscious awareness. So it's essentially an involuntary action. And it turns out that your brain is always trying to keep rhythm. So this was done by Yi Du and colleagues from the Chinese Academy of Science, and this article was published quite recently. So our bodies naturally just respond to music, which is really cool. And we've done a podcast episode on the power of music as well. So our brain just wants to be part of this music. So in the research, essentially, there were over 100 participants, and the researchers were measuring the subconscious blinks without them controlling the blinking. And the researchers made the participants listen to Western classical music. They found out that the participants' blinks started to sync up with the music and that their brain waves also aligned. The participants blinked in time anyways, even when the tune was backwards, because at this point the tune isn't familiar anymore because it's playing backwards. So the only way that this synchronization would be disrupted is when the researchers gave the participants a task to do. So, for example, while the music is playing, they'd have the participants look at a screen in front of them with a dot and focus on the red dot, and that is when they would be too focused to synchronize their blinks with the music. Studies like this helps the broader neuroscientific research pool to understand how pathways in the brain connect, how different senses and brain functions interact, and there has been recent evidence indicating that motor neurological conditions can be treated with music therapies that engage with auditory motor synchronization. So this can be quite useful for future therapies for motor disorders, which is pretty cool. So, moving on to today's topic of the day, which I have found fascinating my entire life. And this podcast episode idea really arrived to me based on a conversation I was having where we were just talking about how time seems to be going by so quickly when you're having fun. You don't realize that it's been 3 hours that you're, watching a movie if it's a good movie. On the other hand, sometimes, say you're in a lecture, for example, time just drags on. 10 minutes feel like an hour. You're just constantly checking the time. Okay, when is this over if you're really not enjoying the lecture? So today's podcast topic is time perception, or what scientists called chronoception. So time perception is a very subjective experience. There is absolute time that is measured, in minutes and hours. For example, I'm recording the podcast right now and I can see that I've been recording for 6 minutes because there's unit seconds that amount to unit minutes and unit hours, things like that. So time perception is essentially if I didn't know how much time had passed, how much time do I think would have passed, or how much time do you think has passed since you've been listening to the start of this episode. So it's a very subjective experience and it's wildly inconsistent. It's really hard to guess a time exactly. This isn't about a mechanical clock ticking away, it's about a very personal internal timer in your head. So we're going to find out in this episode that our sense of time is shaped less by maths and physics actually, and it's more by our emotions, our age, and our environment. Where would our brain clock be? I actually used to think that our sense of time perception would be associated with our circadian rhythm, because the circadian rhythm, which is managed by the suprachiasmatic nucleus in our brain, is a very deep brain structure, and it basically governs the daily cycle of you waking up, sleeping, responding to light. But our sense of time, our sense of subjective time or time perception, is not in a singular spot. So researchers believe that it's managed by this highly distributed system across the brain involving the prefrontal cortex, the cerebellum, and the basal ganglia. The reason why researchers think that time distribution is located in these areas is because these areas are responsible for attention, learning, and awareness, which come in handy when we're trying to subjectively figure out how much time has passed. If we think about it, our brain isn't just one stopwatch. There's this whole orchestra of different timers playing at a slightly different rhythm depending on, again, your emotions, what age you are, and the environment that you're in. This system in our brain that is really fine-tuned to time perception is incredibly sensitive to what you're doing and how that activity makes you feel. A classic example is what we call the fun boredom paradox. So as I mentioned before, time flies when you're having fun and it drags when you're really bored. So when you're fully engaged and motivated, it makes you more present and your brain is focused on the task. So you actually don't really pay attention to how much time is going. But if you're bored, you're like, oh, I'm so bored. when is this going to finish? When is an activity going to be more interesting so that I don't feel bored anymore? So you feel every single minute more magnified than it actually is. And again, this whole phenomena of time perception is heavily tied to our brain chemistry. This is actually something that I find so interesting about neuroscience and psychology, that they're so intertwined, because psychological behaviors and our emotions, they're all chemically driven. Dopamine, which is the neurotransmitter associated with reward and pleasure, which honestly deserves an entire podcast episode to itself, because dopamine is the neurotransmitter released in drugs of abuse. It's the neurotransmitter whenever you achieve something. It's essentially what everyone is chasing in a way, but it's just such an interesting neurotransmitter, and I absolutely adore dopamine. Anyways, dopamine is associated with reward and pleasure, and whenever we're really happy, or like we have a lot of dopamine in our brain, essentially, it appears to speed up our perception of time. So again, when you're enjoying an activity, you have this rush of dopamine, and it makes you feel like time's going faster, like you underestimate how much time has gone. You're like, oh, it's only been half an hour. No, it's been an hour and a half, So dopamine helps you feel like time is going faster. On the flip side, there's something called the slow motion effect in time perception. There's a neuroscientist called David Eagleman, and he famously studied this by having people go on an amusement park ride, the kind of ride that will drop you from like 15-story building heights down. And later on, all of the participants in this study, where he essentially made them go on a ride that makes them like drop down from incredibly high heights, they overestimated how long it took. So it must have been a few minutes, but they thought that they were in there for way longer than they were on that ride. When we face stress, when we face danger, there's the release of chemicals like noradrenaline, which is quite similar to adrenaline, and it heightens our alertness. When you're in a sense of fight or flight, the brain seems to capture this incredible amount of detailed data in that situation. When you're scared, you tend to remember things in much more vivid detail because you were so frightened, and that it kind of slows our perception down so that we can actually process the threat in a very detailed manner. Even when you're in awe of something, so you go to the zoo, or you see a waterfall, or you're in this absolutely beautiful, picturesque location, studies have shown that when people feel awe, they report that the passage of time is feeling slower compared to neutral emotional states. Coming to our next little segment of this episode, which is quite an interesting one with aging. So there is this slow motion camera effect when it comes to being young. Why does time speed up as we age? It's a combination of biology and psychology. When we're young, the world is so new to us, obviously, because we've just been born. A researcher has said that, and I quote, "When we are young, each second of actual time is packed with many more mental images." It's like a slow motion camera capturing thousands of frames. You remember your school, you're going to school for the first time. It's not a repetitive thing when you're just starting out. You're meeting new people, you're expanding your sense of self, and time appears to pass slower when you're young because you're also quite physically small, and you've seen all these big people around you, and you know that you have a lot of time to grow to that size, essentially. You have a lot more memories to process, and you're quite inexperienced in everything. So everything is a literal new experience for you, whether that's learning how to cycle, learning how to bake a certain cookie, and even making a bracelet, or reading for the first time. Sometimes I think we take things for granted, that there was a time when we didn't know how to do anything, and we've learned and evolved in such a wonderful way to be able to function the way that we do. As a kid, even using technology for the first time, that's cool. So as we get older, our lives tend to be more routine. Your brains get used to doing certain activities that as a kid would be completely new to you. So our brain's networks of neurons, they also become more complex now because you're older, you have a lot of experience, you have a lot of memories. So your neural pathways are quite complex, they're intricately intertwined, and that can also slow down the rate at which you process new information because it'll take slightly longer amidst all that tangle of neurons than it would when you're younger because you don't have as much of a tangle of neurons. Now, coming to the psychological factors, if you just think about it mathematically, when you're 10 years old, a singular year is 10% of your whole life as a kid. But when you're 40 years old, a singular year is only 2.5%. So a single year makes up a much smaller percentage of your total lifespan as you keep on growing older. By the time that you're 100, 1 year is 1% of your life. So it does make you feel like time is going faster as you age because your relative life experience keeps on increasing. And 1 year would just start becoming much smaller compared to the rest of the amount of years that you've lived, essentially. Now, beyond our emotions and our age, even your focus and your surrounding environments can affect your internal clock. So there's something called the oddball effect that I came across in so many resources during my research for this episode. So the oddball effect is an example of how attention can warp your times. In experiments done to study the oddball effect, the subjects were shown a series of images. One of these images in the series was said to be unusual, or quote unquote the oddball. So the subjects perceived that the oddball image stayed longer on the screen than it actually did. Why so? Because the brain needs extra time and attention to process the unusual stimulus. So when you're used to something, your sense of time is steadier, but when you notice something different, you take a bit longer to actually register that you've seen something different, essentially contributed to the subjects feeling that the image stayed longer on screen because they were taking more time to register it. And your environment matters too. So researchers found that people perceived time as moving more slowly when they're walking in nature on a hike, on a forest trail, compared to when they're in a bustling urban location. It does kind of make sense because essentially cities do tend to have a much faster pace, and that can make you feel like you have to not rush everywhere, but there's a sense of time moving quite quickly, and the relaxation that occurs when you're in a more natural setting. It's just nature, it's much more peaceful. Nature does appear to make time feel a bit slower, so it lengthens your experience of time. Now finally, even the language that we speak can actually very ever so slightly change how we think about the duration of times. There were studies done comparing English and Swedish speakers with Spanish speakers. So English and Swedish speakers tend to use terms like a short break, a long wedding. So these are spatial terms essentially, but Spanish speakers tend to use terms that actually amount to like volume. So that's a small break instead of a short break in English, and that's a big wedding. So you see more volume in terms within the Spanish language. This linguistic difference can influence how a person can estimate how long an event has been. The way that culturally people are framed to think of time can kind of creep into your perception of it, essentially. So yeah, there you have it. That is time perception or chronoception. It isn't a fixed measurement. It's a very relative, subjective experience that changes based on fear, joy, boredom, the urban environment, a walk in the woods, and even the beat of music that you're listening to. Philosopher Henri Bergson argued that you must put aside the idea of a single time. What counts are the multiple times that make up experience. So our brain's ability to stretch and compress time is a powerful demonstration of its amazing ability to adapt to the events around us. So just to note, the exact reasons for time perception are still quite unclear, but a lot of theories exist. In a way, I guess what we can conclude from the idea of time perception is having newer experiences. So yeah, thanks for tuning in, guys. That's the end of today's episode of The Shenanigans with Shreya. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.